It's 7 o'clock, and I know we will probably have a few people dribble on in from now, but I'd like to go and get started. My name is Mark Buckby. I'm the Education Director for Communities for Healthy Forests, one of the sponsoring organizations of this. First of all, welcome to Jacoby Auditorium. Welcome to the home of the Riverhawks, and also to the home of a most excellent forestry and natural resource program. Okay, this presentation by Dr. John Bailey is sponsored by 4 local organizations, by Communities for Healthy Forests, by the Douglas County chapter of the Small Woodlands Association, the Umpqua chapter of the Society of American Foresters, and by the UCC Forestry Club. Okay, well, let's get into the presentation itself. Dr. John Bailey, he's professor of silviculture and fire management at Oregon State University. Go Bees. And go Bees. This is him right here. He's been there since 2006. And previously, though he was a professor at Northern Arizona University down in Flagstaff, John has a BS from Virginia Tech, I guess. Yeah, and then masters and doctorates from OSU. So he spent a lot of time in his life and his career here in Oregon. John is author or co-author of, I counted about 100 scholarly articles as I went through his, curriculum vitae, whatever the terminology is. John is also the chairman of the Society of American Foresters National Committee on Forest Policy and gets to interact with foresters throughout the United States in that capacity. So tonight he will be talking about fuels and fire management in Western Oregon, a topic obviously we here in Douglas County care an awful lot about, particularly since Labor Day of 2020, where it really came home to give us a message, to give us a warning. So, would you please welcome Dr. John Bailey.
And thanks for coming out this evening. I was driving down through just tremendous rainstorm and snow mixed in with it, and this time of year I always have that thought. It's always so difficult to come and talk about wildfire and fire, whether it's a student class or a public forum like this, when the weather is just this wet and cold. But we all know in our heart of hearts that this summer will be a fire season coming. As a matter of fact, the fire dogs in here will know that if it's a wet late spring, it's still going to be a good fire season because we're going to have all those fine fuels. If it's a dry spring, it's going to be a good fire season because it's going to dry out soon and get going. So regardless, here in Oregon, we're going to have a good fire season coming. Program tonight is a big section here to start with on just focus, and there we want to get at the fact that yes, things are complex. There's a lot going on. I was talking with some folks earlier that the Cascades, is in Douglas fir, even dry Douglas fir is still really different than ponderosa pine and that time that I had in northern Arizona. So yeah, things are more complex. But we can focus on just some of the basics. And so we're going to spend a little bit of time on that, and hopefully I'll say a few things that'll upset you maybe and have you write a question and we can argue about it a little bit. But step one for us as a society, at least I want you to think about this, is we got to focus on what we do know, rather than just spinning our wheels on it, because this is an existential challenge for us moving forward. It really is, and so we're going to have to come together, and the only way we're going to be able to do that is to focus. Then we got to get to work, and even small efforts and things we can do. So we'll spend a little bit of time in the talk. Just on what are the efforts that are doable and that we can get going on tomorrow to address this issue. And it's only through that effort that we're going to have any hope moving forward. And I mean that in the sense of making some progress on this, but actually from that more heartfelt spiritual side of hope. Hope isn't going to come from me saying anything tonight. But if we get going on this and do some things, that will give you hope, and particularly the students, the younger generation that can, some of this is some Dr. Doom kind of stuff that we're going to cover. The only way we're going to have any hope coming out of this is to get moving on some of these topics and get things going. So with that preface, we'll go in. Oh, here's a couple different shots of my progression over my career as a firefighter in '83, and then I got into all the research and sciencey kinds of stuff. And all the way up in 2017 was really what ignited my this lifestyle of saying more often saying yes to coming and speaking in public and telling this story, playing this narrative, and it ultimately resulted in the book that I'm going to show you as well. But that was the fire up in the gorge, the Eagle Creek fire in 2017, to really start solidifying this message. So let's start with a little bit of backstory and focusing on some of this reality and what we're dealing with. I put my little hard hat there in 1983 for the start of my career. It was also kind of the low point in terms of numbers of acres that were burning, high point in our sense of how much we could really regulate the impact that wildfire was going to have on society. It was a period where we had a lot of science, a lot of technology post-World War II, and a stable climatic period that allowed us to put out a whole lot of fire. And I was a part of that, and so I come into group and say, yes, my name is John, and I suppressed wildfire for a long time. There's been a steady increase since then, and we're up to about 10 million acres now. But that increase is small relative to the decrease from the historic ecological past of fire in this part of the world. And even the 1910 kind of acreages that were burning, big year for formation of the Forest Service and our psyche about wildfire, that was only our best estimate. We didn't keep records the same way then. Was 30 to 40 million acres, so well within the size of this chart in all. But 10 million acres now is not much relative to the acreage that burned. Of course, there are a lot more humans now, and the way things are burning now is different. So this is the context, and as we go back in time and look at these fire scars and all those kinds of things, that kind of 50, 60, 80 million acres was the norm for 15,000 years for what was burning in this part of the world. So fire has been a part of this system for a long time. And the plant adaptations, the landscape, the fuel pattern landscape is built on that. And the amount of change that we've seen in the last 100 years is staggering, thanks to our land management practices, including fire suppression itself. So here's an example. This is the Cascades, foothills of the Cascades, drier site that has remnant ponderosa pine in it, but still also Douglas fir, large Douglas fir in them. We've gone into these kinds of stands and cut out fire scars and done the dendrochronology, all the cross-dating to look at how much fire. And the mean fire return interval in these kinds of stands can be 5 to 15 years, nearly as low as ponderosa pine on the other side of the hill. There was a lot of fire even on the west side of the Cascades. If you have Oregon white oak, remnant Oregon white oak in your stand, then that was probably 3 to 10 year fire return intervals on that land. Then in this picture with 100 years of fire exclusion, the 9 out of 10 trees, 95 out of 100 trees were born and have come in and grown in the 100 years of fire suppression. That's a fundamental change in the fuel model. The stand density, the stand characteristics, we've created forest types that have never existed before, a level of fuel on an acre-by-acre basis that is higher than has existed in 15,000 years, and more alarming is those acres are more connected, one next to the other, than they've ever been. So we have created this fuel hazard because the vegetation growth is fuels, and it's the trees, but it's also the surface fuel accumulation, the sheer number of BTUs now that are stored up in that litter layer that dry out sufficiently most years, that probabilistically, if we get an ignition, burns and produces a lot of heat and kills the trees. If we take that fuel hazard and multiply it by the probability that it's going to burn and by the values that are going to be encountered when it does burn, that's what gets at this concept of wildfire risk. The hazard times the probability times the value. If we don't value it, there's no risk. If there's no probability it's going to burn, there's no risk. If there's no hazard, there's no risk. But we put those three together. Of course, the wildland-urban interface is a classic example of this kind of high value, high probability of burning, and they're also typically loaded with fuels as well. And that's really what's caught up with us in the last 3 decades, is that all three, the probabilities associated with all three elements have gone up. And the example, a little hard to see on the screen over there, is a insurance chart looking at the wildland-urban interface and the probability that it's going to burn. And yeah, the bars look small over there on the right, but that's about 5 million homes in the United States that has the probability of about a 1 in 3 chance of burning in the next 30 years. So those bars are probabilities, numbers of homes likely to burn in the next 30 years. And there are a whole bunch. There are a whole bunch of houses. The bottom left map, the yellow color, are rangeland wildland-urban interface, very flashy fires. Those of you familiar with Phoenix and Talent, that's the kind of fire, the kind of wildland-urban interface that we had. Or if you think of Lahaina in Maui, that's the kind of wildland-urban interface and the kind of fire that we get. But there are a lot of other forested wildland-urban interfaces, particularly back east. Again, this is what the insurance industry is looking at, and this is what I think political leaders should be looking at as well. It's lost on the far right-hand chart. All that shows is new home starts in the wildland-urban interface starting. It shows the economic decline in 2008, but since 2008, the number of new home starts in the wildland-urban interface has started increasing again. So even politically and in terms of land use planning and that kind of stuff, we're still not thinking about wildland-urban interface and what's going on in reality out there. Part of the probability of burning, and that part of the equation really is climate change. Fire seasons in this part of the world are already 40 to 50 days longer. In some parts of the Pacific Northwest, 60 days, a full 2 months longer. The firefighters in here can attest to that. It impacts not only the length of the fire season, the dryness of the fuels, the vapor pressure deficit that influences fire spread rates, the cumulative climate water deficit, and how that influences dead fuel and live fuel moistures that are out there, the length of the snowpack, and all that plays out in acres burned, suppression cost, the acres of high severity fire, all of that. You've seen the charts from NOAA and other organizations that show that this increase in warmth and the length of the fire season, every projection has it increasing moving forward. So fuels are still accumulating. Fire seasons are getting longer and will continue to get longer. The other element is just humans and our human values. Those are still expanding as well. So, you don't have to be a prophet to think that fire seasons are only going to continue to get worse, because it's only probabilities that's going to happen. And there are all kinds of new publications for how bad the temperature increases might be for the Pacific Northwest in general, all of the western United States, this part of Oregon, whatever you want to look at. In this paper that just came out a couple weeks ago in Ecological Applications, we can pull up the reference later, that really looks throughout the Pacific Northwest and into these different sub-regional groups, including this part of the world with the West Cascades, and looking at the numbers of fires and the average sizes and how that might change seasonally and those kinds of things. Not every part of the Pacific Northwest is going to show an increase, but this part of the world shows 10 to 20% increase in both the number of fires and in the size of those fires. And all the different multicolored symbols and all are different assumptions, different model runs, different ways of forecasting fire spread. So here, kind of a summary diagram for thinking about this interplay of fuels and weather and values or the fire season. Historically, and what for 15,000 years created a relatively fuel-limited landscape that burned at the tune of 50, 60, 80 million acres. The amount of high-severity fire that threatened the things that the peoples of the time valued, since there was so little overlap between those three elements, that overlap of high-impact, high-severity fire was just small. It's that yellow area there labeled a zone of high severity. And what we have now, given that all three of those have expanded, just the logical probabilistic conclusion that zone is substantially bigger and projected to only get bigger moving forward. So that's the Dr. Doom kind of side of things. And I've summarized that in a number of chapters of a book just published a couple weeks ago, and I brought a box of them with me tonight. If you're interested in picking one up on Amazon, $21.95. I'll sell it to you for $20 tonight in cash or Venmo, and I'll be selling it afterwards. But it's where I've taken this kind of message, at least the first 4 or 5 chapters, about how this narrative has changed, ties into fire history and fire ecology, in this kind of basic situation of risk and all. It's the first few chapters of this book before the rest of it goes into some of these efforts that we can do. But I want to pause at this point and see if we want to argue anything on anything that I said that you just think is wrong about fuels or climate. Seeing no objections, I'll just move forward. Now, if you can bring the lights up, and although Mark wanted to save questions at the end, so here's I'm going to pause 20 seconds, and you can write a question. If you can see your paper, you can write a question about any of these elements. Has the fuel hazard really increased? Has the fire season really gotten any worse? Are there more humans, and particularly stupid humans, out there creating more fire or being impacted by fire? Yes? Mm-hmm. Yes, and some of that is change in policy, primarily built around firefighter safety and that kind of stuff. So the culture of firefighting has changed a little bit. I think a much bigger change in how suppression effectiveness has changed. A bigger part of it is just the ability to get out there on initial attack when fires are small, how long they stay small, and our ability to respond and get out there when they are small. Because back in 1983, the weather conditions, the fuel conditions were such when we got lightning strikes, I could head out in the engine and knock 4 of them out before lunchtime. They didn't get up and going very fast. Some of these fire starts that we have now, they're crowning in 20 minutes. And the roads aren't good enough to get out there in 20 minutes. So, so some of it is just the reality as well as policy changes and a focus on safety and that kind of stuff. But we have more experienced people and more recently experienced people if we want to come back to this topic later and explore it some more. All right, so let's talk about what we can do. I still organize my thoughts around the National Cohesive Strategy, three-legged stool of creating resistant and resilient landscapes out there, fire-adapted human communities that are going to be able to withstand the reality of wildfire more moving forward, and then some changes to the suppression types approaches that make for a safer and more effective response to it. We can dive into some of those things, particularly if you have questions, but as a land manager, a silviculturist, fire manager, and all, I tend to focus on that broader question of resistant and resilient landscapes. I definitely get the message that one of the things we can do first and foremost is just have defensible space around our homes and help our neighbors with defensible space as well, because if their house burns, it really increases the likelihood that our house will burn. So we can definitely do a better job there, but that's not as complex of an issue as land management and forest management issues are. And I'm not ready to kiss the forest goodbye anyway and just let it burn just so we can save the houses and wrap all our houses in tin foil. Because the forest is an amazing thing. I was talking to folks earlier. The forest is certainly the timber and the jobs and the economies, at the root of what is Oregon. But it is also clean water and whole watershed protection issues and wildlife, a whole range of wildlife and biodiversity and life and spiritual values and cultural plants and recreational opportunities and scenery. And it is this wonderful thing that is all of those things. It is all those things at once, and it's also fuel. And it's fuel at the same time that is going to burn. That is just inevitable. So we have to do a better. I don't think we want to just kind of kiss it goodbye. I think we can, in fact, exert some effort and do a better job of managing these landscapes. That not every acre is going to meet all of those values at one time, but as a beautiful, productive landscape, we certainly can, have the win-win-win-win situation moving forward. Because these landscapes, yes, sometimes they are roaring fires that then come into our areas that we really value. Most of the time it's just ember rain that comes into our communities and burns things. The new 2023 wildfire mitigation report that came out, I guess the kind words, builds on and extends the national cohesive strategy, but in many ways kind of wraps it around and balls it up, because now there are 7 areas that kind of overlap. And who's read it recently? Was it 118 recommendations or something like that? Some of them very logical, some of them a little bit more obscure and all that kind of stuff. We're only going to spend a little bit of time diving into a couple of the areas. I'm going to skip the brown parts completely. The green ones are these tools and actions and science and modeling and those kinds of things that we have more of it available now than we've ever had. And it's just exploding. Students that are interested in studying this kind of thing and coming on to graduate school and expanding all this science and tools that we have. It's a remarkable time. But the action, the effort, also equally has to go into the action. Translating the science, the technology, the models, and all this new stuff that is available, making it available to the actual land managers that are out there to do these fuel reduction treatments, these broader land management treatments that fold fuels reduction into it, that follow more of our 15,000-year tradition of actually managing the landscape that we're in. So some of it is the home hardening part that is in these actions. But most of it is the broader land management, fuel management kinds of things that we're going to talk about. There's always debate about whether or not fuels treatments are effective, but I can tell you definitively, and in the book I call that chapter, why fuels treatments work every time. And that's because it's just physics. So we'll get right back to focusing on those basics. If you remove fuel from the equation or lessen the amount of fuel in that equation, the flame length, the heat release, the rate of spread goes down every time. Now, that doesn't mean every land management thing that we do out there is an effective fuels treatment and changes fire behavior for the better, lessens fire behavior. But if it is actually a fuels treatment, it is going to lessen fire intensity every time. And if it's substantial enough, it can have implications for the severity, the impact that that fire is going to have on that hillside or on those homes or on those streams or on that wildlife habitat or on the scenery or whatever. So that is a very simple game to play. It's to remove some of the fuels from that equation to lessen the intensity and the severity of the fire. And we have on-the-ground case studies, on-the-ground meta-analysis, comparisons of science. We have enough of these research plots, including some of my own, that have subsequently burned. And now we have great satellite approaches for producing this kind of science that looks at the range that, when wildfire does encounter areas that are treated, the fire behavior is different. Not every time, because sometimes it's on south-facing slopes, or sometimes untreated areas burn at night, and so not every untreated area burns severely. Not every thin and prescribed burned area survives a wildfire event, but the weight of the evidence is super compelling that fuels treatments work even out broadly in the real world. And then if we look at the Labor Day, Mark mentioned the Labor Day 2020 fires themselves. I think I saw copies of this report out in the lobby if you want to pick it up. It's a really nice report put together by OFRI that looked at even across the range of ownerships and different management objectives and everything. This trend holds that only about a third of these fire perimeters burn as high severity, high impact kind of fires. The rest are mixed or low or no intensity burning. So that's going to be something to remember. Now, there are, particularly as we crank up and make 1 million acres, if a third of 1 million acres burns at high severity, students, how many acres is that? 333,000 acres. That is too much. That's too many acres of high severity fire, more than has ever happened since the last ice age. So this we don't want to get too carried away with that only a third is okay. It's still too much when we're having very large fires out there. And one of the interesting things buried in this pattern, though, is the older, larger timber, because part of this red sensitivity of high severity is because of age structure and the size of the trees. So industrial lands, which is the second bar, large private is what that's labeled. The amount of mature timber that burned is relatively low. That's the blue stack. The far left is the Forest Service, and most of what burned under high severity on federal lands, on Forest Service lands, was larger merchantable timber. Whereas that's a smaller percentage, a smaller chunk, smaller sized bar on private land. So some of this, as we start blaming federal lands or blaming industry lands for where we're seeing losses and stand replacing fire and values being impacted, it's a different starting point for making that comparison. And then the blue parts of this new Wildfire Commission report really has to do also with a lot of these fuels treatments and land management directions that we can take. With, for me, a particular eye to beneficial fire here at the bottom. And so I want to talk about that for a bit and talk about prescribed burning, cultural burning, and the pods concept, relatively new concept for many people for planning for these large wildfire events that we got. When it only happened once in our career, it didn't make a lot of sense to plan for them, but now that they happen almost every year of our career, it makes sense that we can imagine what they're going to be like, and we have more modeling tools now to actually play around with ignitions at different spots and how they're going to spread under different fire weather conditions, and we can plan our operational responses well in advance of the fires actually happening. First off, for a recent figure on prescribed fire, again, broad meta-analysis about whether or not prescribed fire treating fine surface fuels with fire itself is effective. Ta-da! Yes, it is effective every time in reducing fuels, but also in creating an ecological response, in this case, species richness kinds of things. So there are compelling fuels reduction reasons to burn, and there are compelling ecological reasons to put fire on the ground as management ignited fire or as fire management, as we're going to talk about. And so that brings us to these planned operational delineations, or pods. And there, we have to think it's going to be the only way that we're going to be able, in my opinion, that we're going to be able to make fire management work in the future. With a generation and coming out of an era, coming out of multiple generations, where fire burning in the hillsides was seen as threatening and something that needs to be suppressed every time. So we've just got to be ready and build experience with these planned operational delineations if we're going to be able to use pods moving forward as a fire management tool rather than just always having management ignited fire. So here's an analysis that Chris Dunn did back when he was a student of mine that looked at a heavily eroded landscape, multiple ownerships out there. It's actually just east of here. And he did this analysis actually prior to the Douglas Complex fire. And the incident commanders did not have access to this kind of work that Chris was doing at the time. But it becomes an interesting case study because Chris independently had developed this idea of a simplified road system and breaking this landscape view into 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 acre chunks of material. Looking at the black are existing roads. Maybe they weren't that good of roads, but roads that could be brushed back and maintained as potential control lines somewhere in the future. And the small stretches of white would be some potential control lines that would have to be constructed to kind of tie these pods together. But they would be potential control lines somewhere in the future. So on the day of the Douglas Complex, in this field of view were 36 ignitions, but they were not all suppressed, as you'll see. And in the first 2 days, there's a rapid amount of spread, and dominantly that high severity red color spread. It's fuels are dry, the winds are pretty high. And then we got a small rainstorm a couple days into the event. And you're going to see a lot less red and a lot more spread of yellow and blue fire. And you'll start, if your eyes are really good, you'll start seeing some back burning that comes in as well. After a day or two, there's an incident commander on here. They're choosing these potential control lines and areas that they want to hold this fire. And since Chris also was keying in on many of the same features, the incident commander at 2 o'clock in the morning is keying in on those same roads and those same features and choosing them as potential hold lines. And there's going to be an area right up here, kind of towards the center of the diagram, that once that fire gets into the bottom of that drainage, there'll actually be some backfiring from that road. That's going to show up here one of these days. There it is. But it also includes some 2 dozer lines straight down the slope to the creek bottom and all that kind of stuff, when really we could have used one of these pod boundaries instead and just burned another couple hundred acres in that drainage. So final perimeter, August 20th, after a better part of a month, about 50,000 acres in this field of view, dominated by red high-severity fire in those first few days. After that, it's just big enough where it's a big incident. Trying to contain it, trying to keep it out of the local community, and those kinds of things. But much more favorable, low-risk fire behavior in those subsequent days. And I think that's the key thing to think about is that. That yellow and blue coloration and all, some of the red patches in those days are young plantations. They're not. That's not crown fire behavior in more mature stands. It's young plantations. Maybe not the best veg management practices, maybe not the best site preparation before it was planted. Chemical site prep doesn't get rid of the stored BTUs on the site. It does a great job with living vegetation, but all the residual slash and any of that first regrowth, all of that fuel is still on the site. It's got 5-year-old trees, in that fuel bed. If sparks get in there and it starts spreading, then it's going to make a red polygon in this direction, in this kind of map, because 5-year-old trees just are not going to have that kind of resistance to it. But I've been to plenty of plantations, I'm sure you guys have as well, where very thorough site prep and early veg management, 5-year-old trees do just fine because the fire can't burn through the unit. There's just not enough fuel out there for it. So everyone, all of the land managers in these kind of landscapes can figure out ways to lessen the amount of red that we're going to get in these kinds of figures. I realize that it's going to be a big lift thinking about using fire, planning these pods in advance, choosing these conditions under where that initial attack may not be to contain it to 10 acres. It might be to burn out a 3,000 acre pod, where we've already planned the control lines. That's going to be a big lift socially and culturally, even within our own organizations, much less our communities. But we don't have a choice, because this stuff's going to burn anyway. We can continue attempting 100% suppression. We're down to 98.7% suppression. That's only going to go to about 96%, 95% success. As we move forward. We've got to change something. Some of you maybe knew Bill Aney, who was one of my mentors when I first came to Oregon. And in addition to being a fire dog, he also was a high school track coach for his kids up in the Portland area. And he had this great analogy, talking about this kind of situation, where he goes, when your track team has been lapped and is getting lapped, and that's where we are as a fire community now. We have been lapped by the fuels and climate change, and we are getting lapped. We have been lapped, and we are getting lapped in the race right now. You can't just yell at the kids to run faster. We have to change this race. And pods is going to be one of the approaches to changing the race. That's the only way. We can't just run faster in our current system. If it's going to burn anyway, and we're going to keep doing this, and we're going to deny that we need to change, then we're just going to continue to have more red that's going to happen on these, and therefore more communities that are impacted, and budgets are going to blossom, and workforce is going to retire, and all those kinds of things. So our challenge is we've got to make this change. All right, so that's the focus we need to have on the basics of what we're up against. These are the kind of efforts that we can make in terms of better land management and fuel management, particularly prescribed burning, and the possibility that pods will hold for us moving forward. So is there any hope? Sure. The hope comes from the fact that we know, I already showed you some of the fuels treatment data. We know that works, that it works every time. And if we do enough of it, it is effective over the landscape. If we do 100 acres in a 10,000 acre watershed or fire shed, then we've done good work on those 100 acres, and it's not going to make any difference at all in terms of landscape fire. But if we do 3,000 of the 10,000 acres, that's going to start impacting landscape level fire flow. It's going to be good for those 3,000 acres, plus it's going to influence the other 7,000 acres. And if we do 7,000 acres, that last 3,000 acres is good to go, because we're going to definitely impact fire flow on that landscape. Just good rules of thumbs, 1/3, 2/3, and that kind of stuff. And between that 1/3 and that 2/3 is a big difference of where we choose. So like those pod boundaries, where we're going to interrupt fire, where we're going to do the fuels treatments, where we're going to be able to impact landscape level fire flow during these large fire events. So that is great stuff. We know that works. And we know we can even spend money doing it, and we'll make money in the long run. So the organizations and owners that want to invest a couple $100 per acre into these fuels treatments, that's going to pay off in the long run. And it's going to protect communities and a bunch of things that are a bunch of these values that are very hard to measure. But just from a standing tree perspective, a couple $100 an acre will pay off in the long run, because more trees will survive. And it's going to have less implications for cost we're going to bear in the future. As we look at suitable windows for prescribed burning, in our part of the world is actually going to get a little bit better. We're going to have more days in, so the one on the left is December, January, and February. Foothills of Corvallis, we're not going to do any burning in December, January, February, or we might have one day up there. But down in the more southern parts of the states, we're going to gain some days that we can burn in that off season. And then June, July, August, we're going to pick up days as well for our prescribed burn windows. Of course, assuming we can get smoke clearance. The spatial dynamics for thinking about how to do fuels management and this land management approaches and all. This publication out of the DNR, Department of Natural Resources in Washington, has some great graphics and summaries if you want some more data on fuels treatment working and that kind of stuff. There are the defensible space around communities. There's using fuels treatments and thinning and daylighting of main road systems. Those are those pod boundaries. There's a little example here in the red circle in there that you can't see is a little prescribed burner walking along the roadway, a daylighted road, because that spring or fall burn window along these fuels treatments along roads is a much larger burn window in those open characteristics than we would have in a closed system. And this kind of ties into some of the indigenous knowledge again. Going back 15,000 years, we know how to burn under different conditions out there. So we can do it because it's going to require maintenance of those fuels, and the fine surface fuels are a key part of it. But we can tie all of this spatial analysis with the topography, with the roads, with the trails, with the communities, with everything that we do out there. We can remember that these are fueled landscapes and fueled landscapes that are going to burn. It ties in with many of our concepts. We talked about a fuel-laden landscape and restoration treatments that we need to do out there from just an ecological perspective, much less a fire-wise, resilient landscape perspective. A lot of these concepts are very consistent. Here's one of my Northern Arizona University ecological restoration treatments, and opened it up enough. It's been burned twice. There are ponderosa pine seedlings regenerating, so we're starting to get that multi-age structure that we've been dreaming about and trying to do for the simple ponderosa pine system. So we've worked that out really well. Western Oregon is going to be a lot more complicated with mixed species and complex terrain and those kinds of things, but it's going to involve many of the same basic concepts that we can focus on about having growing space available, creating spatial heterogeneity, both vertically and horizontally, creating diversity out there, and that's going to reduce the fuel risk, but also alter fire behavior that comes through. So the picture on the right is a 25-year-old thinned Douglas fir research plot on the edge of the Holiday Farm fire that burned the same time Archie Creek burned. And that's a treatment that 25 years later had an understory and midstory of western hemlock in it, along with a lot of vine maple and sword fern, and about 70 trees per acre of overstory Douglas fir approaching 100 years old when it burned. The untreated, unthinned, immediately adjacent control area was fried. I mean, the char went 50, 60, 70 feet up the bowl. So it wasn't actively crowning out, but there was just so much heat and heat trapped in there that those crowns are completely scorched out. 99% mortality or higher. And the 20-some-year-old plantation immediately adjacent also was fried for it. This thinned unit, kind of done in the name of developing old-growth structure and northern spotted owl habitat kind of thing, doesn't look too bad. The 9 out of 10 of the overstory Douglas fir survived. 99 out of 100 of the mid and understory western hemlock perished. I like to think that they gave their lives for their Douglas fir brothers out there. But, they're just smaller. They're more fire sensitive. I think they absorbed a lot of the heat, interfered with a lot of that heat transfer that was scorching out the Douglas fir. The char up these trees is only 20 or 30 feet, so fire behavior was definitely dampened in that stand. So yes, mid-story trees are ladder fuels in some senses, but in this case, not a ladder fuel. So this kind of complex structural development vertically, much less horizontally, is going to have implications for fire behavior and fire severity moving forward. So restoration can be effective fuels treatment. Here's back to northern Arizona, and then on the right in Georgia, southeastern United States, with prescribed burning. The one on the right is management-ignited prescribed burning, because there they have a culture of burning about every 3 years in longleaf pine. It's great fun. I spent part of my sabbatical there burning with them. So there's a lot we can learn from our colleagues in the southeast. Northern Arizona there on the left, an area where we had done ecological restoration treatment and done some prescribed burning. And then the West Fork fire burned 50,000 acres of the West Fork of Oak Creek and rolled up onto the Mogollon Rim and basically reburned our research plot for us. Very nice prescribed fire through that area. So this is that example of if we can, with pods thinking and our general land management approaches, if we can get in front of these wildfires a little bit, the wildfires will start doing more of this work for us. So here's a management, we were scheduled to do another prescribed burn there. The wildfire did that work for us, saved us some money. It takes some work to get in front of it. So, here's the Malheur National Forest and some cumulative work, both spatially and in terms of bars, for the number of acres that have been treated. That's the purple bars, or fuels treatment. That big yellow bar is good wildfire from the Canyon Creek fire, the acres of the Canyon Creek fire that burned as non-stand replacing fire. Much of it, I don't think we can say most of it, much of it, though, in areas that had been getting, the purple areas, that had been getting fuels treatments in previous years. So we have that spatial overlap as well. But some of the red, high severity kind of fire, but a relatively small bar. And if cumulatively you look at it, 1.5% of the area now has burned as stand replacing fire. Probably high for a ponderosa pine dominated landscape. But 1.5% is not too bad. I'll take it. We've now treated 15% of it with mechanical treatments and at least piling and burning, if not broadcast burning, after it. But a third of that, 50,000 acres of the Canyon Creek fire, did some of that ecological restoration work for us. So the smallest percentage in this table is that undesirable high-severity fire. A little bit of high-severity fire is fine. 1.5% might even be okay. 30%, not okay. So the hope from this, these are successes. This is the hope that I think that we can hold on to, and particularly if we are the ones that have been out there working on our own homes, working on our neighbors' homes, working with our communities, working with our neighbors to just do a better job of managing our communities and managing our landscapes, then that's what's going to, matched with this data, that's what's going to give us hope moving forward. And we'll be able to do prescribed burning. It's going to make the wildfires just in and of themselves, with or without our management, it's going to make the wildfire impacts themselves better. We need good people making good decisions. I think we're making progress on that. This builds in that ecological resistance and resilience so that subsequent wildfires won't have the kind of devastating effects that they have on the hillsides themselves, much less how they flow into our communities. And at the root of it is going to be proactive management. And then Mark asked me to talk a little bit about a recent MOU, another MOU from the Forest Service saying that we're going to do more of this. So I wanted to reference this. Oh, man, I've got to read the Confronting the Wildfire Crisis. Confronting the Wildfire Crisis. This recent MOU references this 30-page report. This is page 23 or so, that continues to reiterate. This one page is one of 3 or 4 pages that really encapsulates my message tonight, which is so much of this is rooted in proactive management, fuels treatments, the things that we can do a better job. And I think that's particularly fitting for our landscape here in Western Oregon, where we just have a continuum of fuel that we've never had before, and that we certainly have the land management approaches and the things that we can do that breaks up that fuel in a horizontal and vertical sense that can be infinitely consistent with various landowner objectives. So with that, I'll call it an evening. I'll put my book cover back up there. We'll be selling. I'll get some help from the students selling books after I leave the stage up here. They'll be out there somewhere. Owen, Will, and Mark, you're going to collect some questions?
Yes. So I wonder if you could comment on the value of attempting to use prescribed fire as we used to do in those operations tools.
Right, yeah. So the question, those that maybe had trouble hearing that, is that, particularly in a checkerboard ownership with straight line boundaries that don't necessarily follow topography and really different management objectives and histories on either side of that boundary. how are we going to do this kind of collaboration, and particularly around prescribed fire, since that it has a life of its own in many ways, and unlike a bulldozer, not that every bulldozer respects the property line, but fire is even worse than that. So how are we going to do it? So a couple different approaches to answering that. The easy ones being, we're going to have to do it. Ultimately, we have a shared mission, despite differences in our land management objectives. We have different things that we can contribute to the overall health and safety of both the forest and our communities. So in many ways, we have to come together, on that mission, because when the hillside's on fire, we collaborate across these boundaries at 2 o'clock in the morning, gathered over the hood of a pickup truck, and when we haven't slept for 2 days, and everybody's grungy and grumpy, and just trying to make things work. But what brings us together is that shared mission of that moment, and so we need to harness some of that shared mission approach to working together better before it's on fire, planning these pods or however we're going to approach it. Because Mark, we all can do. We can do the variable retention, thinning, multi-age management kinds of things can be done in a more fuel-logical way. Even age management can be done in a more fuel-logical way, particularly around the time of site prep and early veg management. Those are the things that are going to get us together. And with prescribed burning in particular, there can be synchrony between those burning operations, such that we can burn the whole pod, which includes both even-aged and uneven-aged management approaches, within that. But that's with the note that a big open harvest unit is imminently burnable at a different time when a variable retention thinning unit won't be. So maybe we burn the even-age management plantation area first and all around that section that has the more mature BLM timber in it. And then that's the fire break for the next couple of years at least. That's the fire break for doing an underburning in the BLM section. So we have the thoughts, we have the models and all. We need the willpower to make that kind of joint effort work in complex landscapes.
How can we create resilient landscapes in hands-off management areas?
How can we create resilient landscapes in hands-off management areas? Similar answer. First off, we have to, because the preservation model has failed. If you haven't noticed that, and I'm sorry if I'm offending the preservation crowd that might be here, you've got to admit that we have lost hundreds of protected activity centers for northern spotted owls to wildfire. Okay? It did not work to set them aside and draw a line around them, and it's actually a little painful that we even named them protected activity centers, because they were not protected from this existential threat that we have, that is fuel and climate and wildfire. Okay? The same is going to hold for riparian areas or any other areas that we set aside. They are still fuel, and they are going to burn. I always tell groups, picture that favorite area that you go to hunt or camp or whatever. Go ahead and picture it. It's going to burn. All right? That assumption that it's not going to burn, that it's always going to be that way, is wrong. Old growth is not a piece of land. And even riparian areas move around, but the structural condition that is a riparian area also changes year to year, whether it's going to be fire or emerald ash borer or flooding or whatever is going to happen. We have to take much more of a conservation approach than a preservation approach to this. The preservation model is guaranteed, has failed, and is guaranteed to continue failing. So how do we build resilience into these areas that we're otherwise tempted to just draw a line around and let them fend for themselves? Is do sound, good silviculture and wildlife habitat enhancements and all that kind of stuff to ensure that we're going to have healthy riparian areas moving forward, that we're going to have healthy and we're going to have some old growthy kinds of things popping up in the landscape in other places where there's only mature timber now in relatively simple structure, but the old growth is going to burn too. So we have to have new old growth popping up in other places, and we need to get the fuels levels down to best ensure that it's going to actually make it to that stage of development on that particular parcel of ground. But I'm convinced, maybe I'm just optimistic on Thursdays, but I'm convinced that we've got the science and the thought to be able to create fire-resistant and resilient young stands and middle-aged stands and old stands. But we know if we leave it alone, it's just going to burn. Does anyone know the number off the top of their head for this part of the world for how many spotted owl protected activity centers burned in the Biscuit Fire, for example? I was doing that work in northern Arizona, and 55 of them burned in the Rodeo Chetasky Fire. And the Rodeo Chetasky Fire was smaller than the Wallow Fire that happened 4 years later.
Okay, John, maybe once again considering the checkerboard, how does a pod concept fit in where you have industrial neighbors and federal and industrial neighbors? Mm-hmm. I think the pod concept, at least for some of us, is still a little fuzzy.
Yeah.
So you gave the example on what appeared on the map maybe to be national forest. Maybe not. But, okay, things are messy in the checkerboard.
Yeah. On that map was even some checkerboard land and industry land mixed in there. Not as bad as the ONC checkerboard over on the other side of the valley, but definitely mixed ownership. It is nice when it corresponds to at least major roads and or streams. Riparian areas are actually pretty good pod boundaries, as well as roads, probably more effective than ridgetop roads. I think it's a very site-specific question for how you would design, particularly when you have the squares at odd angles up and down the landscapes. Maybe it's going to take fuel breaks. If you really want to maintain that property boundary, it's going to take fuel breaks that follow that straight line cross-diagonal slope, and I think the folks with fire experience that are in here, knows that that's a tough fuel break to build. It's just easier to have a fuel break on a ridge top or down in the valley bottom. So maybe the answer is going to be larger pods, that we have, so that it minimizes the amount of that small-scale edge and straight line boundaries, and we just think bigger. I still dream of land exchanges. I know it's part of Forest Bridge. Denise is gone now. It's part of some of this solution is going to be much more of a joint effort and or land exchanges and that kind of stuff. But it is going to be a tough nut to crack.
Okay. Maybe to the issue of, what do you want to say, positivity versus negativity. But what is the likelihood that we can actually do effective fuel reduction projects on a landscape scale that could significantly increase fire resiliency?
Mm-hmm.
What's it going to take, John?
First of all, fire is already doing this work for us. So I think we can, at least for the next 10 years, we can think about what are we going to do in addition to whatever wildfire is going to do to get some of the fuel off the landscape, which I think can light a fire under our feet, so to speak. to do more of the prescribed burning kinds of things, the easy ones. But do we have the workforce and all that kind of stuff? Is kind of those traditional fuels treatment, thinning, and prescribed burning kind of acres, starting in the wildland-urban interface, expanding out along those pod boundaries where we can give the incident commanders a fighting chance on a hot, dry, east wind kind of day that they can set backfires. But even then, the idea with pod boundaries and these fuels treatments is it's not going to necessarily stop fire under those kinds of conditions. What it really buys us is just more surviving land, more surviving trees, more surviving ecosystems relative to just letting it burn.
Okay. Well, thank you, John. There's so many questions here. We're obviously not going to be able to answer them all. Maybe there's an opportunity that once we put this tape on the Communities for Healthy Forest sites, we could try to answer the rest of these questions.
Okay.
But it's getting late. I don't know if it's snowing out there. Thank you, everyone, for attending. And, John, thank you very much for being here.
My
Please
pleasure.
give John a hand.